I know I'm posting this video right before Iansan gets potential changes, but I'm pretty confident that even if they do nerf her, this duo is strong enough to where it won't impact her team building or overall team damage that severely, and if it does then I can just make a follow-up video, which in this video I want to explore and expand upon why this double attack buffing duo is so strong. Hello there, Flip here, and today we're going to be going over the Bennett Iansan synergy, explaining why it's so strong and why it works in the first place, and then diving into multiple different examples of use cases for this duo and where it shines, to then determine how effective it is overall. But before we do that, as always, if at any point during the video you're entertained or informed, make sure to drop a like and even consider subscribing, as I talk on various topics regarding Genshin's meta and I'll try to keep you updated. Shout out to my channel members, as always your support means the world to me, and with that out of the way, let's begin. First of all, I want to explain how the synergy at base works, because after a lot of posts and tweets on Reddit about my calcs were shared, people seems to just not understand why the synergy is so strong, or spread 5-year-old misconceptions about how stats or buffs work. To first briefly go over the buffing and mechanics of the characters, I would assume you all know what Bennett does. He gives around 1000 flat attack as well as buffing with an extra 20% through noblesse, and being able to give a 15% pyro damage bonus. And with Iansan, she's Natlan, so she has access to the scroll set, as well as giving around 800 flat attack at C5, 30% attack with C2, and a 25% damage bonus at C6, assuming you hit her requirements. Iansan has 2 attack buffs, and her giving a stronger one is based on having a high amount of night soul points, which is upkept by movement. But what we didn't know at the time is that Iansan's buff wasn't based on distance traveled, it's based on overall character model movement. So your character just standing will contribute to Iansan's buff, as your character's model passively moves. Using elemental bursts also contribute to Iansan's buff, as your character model moves around a lot, and so on. Basically almost any character in the game will be able to upkeep Iansan's buff with little issues, and it's essentially a non-issue unless your character is extremely stationary. So no, you don't have to move a ton or be a Natlan character to have Iansan's buff, anyone can really do it, unless we're just receiving bad information. What does actually hurt in her buffing though is her C6, as that very often isn't going to be triggered for most non-Natlan characters consistently, as maintaining her high attack buff seems easy, but actually overcapping on night soul points consistently is where the problem lies to get her C6 buff. But even without her C6 buff, which I'll assume for most non-Natlan characters, this duo is still really fucking good. A lot of people, especially redditors who think they're smart but have never opened a sheet in their life, don't understand why you'd run this duo for characters like Mavuika or Arlecchino, because they reach diminishing returns on attack. But that just isn't how that works. Attack isn't a stat that has diminishing returns. Every point of attack you put into the stat will always give you a linear proportionate increase. If you have 2000 attack and add 500 attack, you get the same increase that you'd get if you were at 3000 attack and add 500 attack. It just doesn't have diminishing returns. The only stat in Genshin that has actual diminishing returns is Elemental Mastery, as at a certain point you don't get the same linear increase proportionate to the amount you put in. And Resistant Shred also partially has diminishing returns, as once you go into the negatives, resistant shreds are half as effective. Most enemies in Genshin have 10% resistance, so even though Viridescent says it shreds 40% resistance, it will actually shred 10% first to reach 0%, and the remaining 30% res shred is halved to 15%. So instead of being at negative 30% like you'd expect, the enemy is actually going to be at negative 15%. This is also why resistant shreds are more effective the more base resistance an enemy has to the damage type you're shredding, as you will actually get the full resistant shred. But regardless, this isn't the same for attack, as you always get the same increase for every point of attack your character has. What is being confused is the opportunity cost of stats, because if you have a lot of attack, that increases the value of other stats like damage bonus and crit, as those will scale harder off of your high attack stat than if you were to have lower attack, and then add damage bonus, if that makes sense. I'm done explaining this. TLDR, no. Stacking attack makes sense, and you will not hit a point of diminishing returns on attack, as that doesn't fucking exist, and there is no as accessible damage bonus buff that is stronger than Iansan's 800 flat attack buff, on top of an extra 30% attack at C2. Can we please be serious? So if having Bennett on your team is a massive damage increase, adding another Bennett level buffer will also be a massive damage boost. The synergy is really that simple. And I know a lot of people want to know about how impactful Iansan's constellations are, in which for the buffing specifically it isn't that big. The best thing about her C6 is that it gives you 3 extra seconds of buff up time, which does matter quite a bit, as Iansan usually is used before Bennett in these teams to set up reactions for scroll, which doesn't matter that much at C6 as their uptime is longer than Bennett's, but it does matter before that as you get less uptime pre-C6. I honestly don't find it that interesting to talk about her pre-C6, as it doesn't actually change where her team stand that much, nor does she really have massive gameplay issues locked behind any of her cons, comparable to something like C0 to C6 Farzan, so you'll still want to use her regardless if she's C6 or not. But for the calcs I'm about to show, going from C6 to C2 you lose about 8 to 10k DPS, so do with that information what you will. But with our synergies now explained, let's talk about the best use cases for this duo, in which let's just get the most controversial one out of the way, being melt teams. The typical melt team core consists of Bennett, Xilonen and Sitlali, and then of course your melt carry, in which you obviously don't want to replace Bennett or Sitlali here. Sitlali practically makes the team archetype and passes TTDS, while Bennett is able to set up pyro for Sitlali to easily melt. Sitlali already holds scroll in these teams, so Xilonen is providing her red shred at a base, and she can also hold Petra, but the problem with this set is due to the fact that Xilonen normally has to be used at the start of your rotation, it makes it so that you don't really get good buff uptime on the set, so your damage drop off is quite significant. And if you remember my spiel about red shredding, Sitlali already makes it so that you'll go into the negatives for red shredding, so you most of the time are applying a half as effective red shred. So despite being good, Xilonen isn't doing much for the team. That's why when adding a buffer like Iansan to Mavuika melt teams, you virtually give the same damage buff as Petra from her C6, as it buffs all of Mavuika's field time. On top of her strong attack buff, she kind of just eclipses Xilonen on the team for Mavuika by a very large amount, to where this has raised Mavuika's damage ceiling as she definitely needed the buff. Mavuika being Natlin and moving a lot has zero issues upkeeping all of Iansan's buffs, to where this easily becomes her best team. And because of the fact that Iansan will consume Nightsteel points alongside both Mavuika and Sitlali, who already consume points, you have zero issues with bursting on Mavuika even if you started from zero. And it's even funnier because Iansan has to keep scroll for her energy requirements, so she essentially has no set on the team, and at least theoretically is still a better damage amp for Mavuika than Xilonen. A lot of people were asking me about constellations and if the same applies to a C2 Xilonen, and yes, Iansan still seems to be very narrowly better than a C2 Xilonen theoretically, but in practice this most likely won't be the case and is just a sheet thing. As for Mavuika's initial burst hit, because of Petra you will get more damage from the nuke using C2 Xilonen, but as Petra runs out the damage evens out, which is why it appears worse on paper. So overall, even though it looks really funny, in practice C2 Xilonen will always be better than a C6 Iansan. Speaking of funny, I just want to also say that no, Iansan isn't Xilonen power creep. Xilonen is still able to buff non-attack scaling carries, and this is just the perfect set of scenarios for Iansan to eclipse Xilonen, being Sitlali having resistant shred making Xilonen's less valuable, Mavuika being able to consistently proc Iansan C6, Sitlali already holding the scroll set as well as it being an 18-second rotation. I decided to also look at an Arlecchino melt team as she's a character that can proc Iansan C6, to see if the same held up, and not really. Even though you get more overall damage per rotation by using Iansan, you have a rotation extension of 2 seconds as Iansan's burst is on an 18-second cooldown, so unless you're pushing 1 rotation breakpoints for Arlecchino, Xilonen will generally still be better, unless we find out there's a rotation that gets Arlecchino to trigger Iansan C6 semi-consistently, which I don't see happening. But even then, Iansan is strong enough on these melt teams that she's still performing relative to what many people consider to be the best support in the game. And I know this is a video about the synergy between Bennett and Iansan, but this got me slightly curious about Xilonen versus Iansan in general, where they are the only scroll holders on the team. So I first looked at Risley melt teams in which Xilonen still tends to be better, due to the fact that when she applies Geo she leaves behind some of the element, which allows Mavuika to melt off of it after Xilonen sets up her cryo scroll buff. And because of this, Mavuika's damage gap through melting is too much that Iansan can't make the difference through her buffing. But I then was like, wait, Iansan is making Risley do more damage on her teams. So I decided to look at Linny, and lo and behold, it seems that for attack scalers pretty universally, that a C5 Iansan not even needing her C6 buff will just be a bigger damage impact assuming it doesn't screw with your rotations, like in the Risley melt team. So the core of Bennett, Iansan, and an attack scaling carry, then just a flex slot of your choice that supports the carry, seems to be competitive if not better than current attack scaling DPS's best teams, even outside of Pyro. So let's keep going, shall we? But really quickly, I just want to say, these type of videos do take a ton of work, so if you enjoy them or have learned something new, then I'd really appreciate any sort of shares of my videos to other platforms, as it does go a long way and is a very effortless way of helping the channel. And thank you very much if you decide to do so, and with that, let's carry on. After a ton of teams that just don't take advantage of Iansan C6 buff, I wanted to look at the rest of the Natlin carries to see who else could utilize this core effectively, in which I obviously had to turn to that man Kinich. Now, a lot of you may be thinking, a team of Bennett, Kinich, Iansan, and Emily, how could that possibly work? You're going to have no burning up time, but that is where you'd actually be wrong. Iansan doesn't apply Electro from off field, meaning that you can use Emily to apply Dendra at the start of your rotation, react with Iansan for the scroll buff, and afterwards Bennett applying Pyro as well as your 2 Dendro characters applying Dendro makes it so that at least in single target you will never actually lose burning, as you can see from the background footage. And I don't think I really need to say it, but because of the other issues Natlan characters had with poking scroll for Kinich, which was mainly Pyro characters not being able to consistently apply scroll past the first rotation, it makes it so that this just becomes Kinich's strongest team currently in terms of sheer numbers, as scroll is never going to fall off even after multiple rotations. But even then there are still some problems with it. The biggest one is just that if the enemy dies, then you just no longer have burning, as Bennett doesn't have any off-field Pyro, which does really hurt the damage of the team, as Kinich will charge his cannon slower and Emily's damage will fall off a cliff, so this is basically only a boss killing team and nothing else. There is a new more complete Kinich Iansan team, though that will have to wait for later this week for me to talk about it. Next up there's Chasca, who I fucking hate calculating this character, but I thought it would be interesting to look at Chasca teams as she'd be enabling her own overvape reactions, while again receiving both Bennett and Iansan's buffs. And getting 3 scroll buffs seems to be pretty consistent with this rotation shown by Noir, to where Iansan shouldn't have any problems with the set. Sadly, it doesn't seem like using this duo enables the best Chasca teams, as that cake is still taken by using both Mavuika and Xilonen. At the very least though, this does seem to be the strongest non-Mavuika Chasca team, which is nice. The last character I didn't look at, but our glorious good Fomfi did his Varesa stuff, which as I always say when he's involved, to make sure to check out his stuff over on Twitch. He's an amazing theory crafter and streams his calculations live, so if you want the fastest beta updates, then he's your man. For Varesa, her strongest team is Chevruz with Mavuika, that still hasn't changed, though at the very least using Bennett is competitive enough and can even be better for you depending on your Varesa's investment. Varesa is a character that can actually freely swap out during her rotations, so in between her combos you can just apply Pyro with Bennett to refresh Chevruz's resistance shred with little issues, and then you can go back into Varesa to finish her combo. And while it isn't her strongest team, it's close enough to where you won't see that massive of a jump in building it. So, in conclusion, this duo is broken. For almost every single attack scaler in the game, it's either their best or second best team, offsetting a lot of valuable supports by sheer amplification from the both of them. I even took a look at replacing Furina in a Wanderer team where he can't even get a scroll buff, and once again it's right next to Furina as a team option able to rival her, which is great. I also did want to look at like Eula stuff, but that will have to be for the next video, as running both Bennett and Iansan together doesn't seem like it'll really be that effective for Eula team specifically. Hopefully the GOAT Iansan won't be nerfed, which I don't think she will, as supports quite literally never get nerfed in beta really, so I don't know why that would start now. But with that, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like, subscribe and comment your thoughts, as I would love to hear it and I respond to almost every single comment. Channel members, I really do appreciate all your support. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you guys on the flip side. Peace.